Hi, I'm Fred McClimans. Today we're talking 2020 ideas with Phil Hassey. Let's talk a little bit about Southeast Asia, the coalescing of the nations into an organization that really has, in the last couple of years, gone from being a regional entity to being an entity really on the legitimate world stage.
Yes. Yeah, it's been interesting as someone who's based in Australia, just south of that ASEAN, but travelled to all the countries there numerous times over the last 10 or 12 years. We've seen them really emerge. They've got free trade agreements with themselves. They use their political power that's increasing as a real way forward to progress their people who have some similarities, but it's a distinct number of countries, but they see where they can benefit from working together and where their citizens and government and business can benefit from working together, and are really strongly developing some close ties and some strong economic and social outcomes.
So now in Southeast Asia, we really do see a very culturally diverse region. People tend to think of it as being very homogenous, and in fact that's not the case at all. There are extreme differences in language, in culture, in politics, religious beliefs, as well as wealth.
Yes.
We've seen some extreme disparities in wealth. How are these issues being addressed, and how are they overcoming them to coalesce?
An incredibly diverse region from Indonesia, which in itself could be made up of half a dozen different cultures, religions and social systems, all the way up through to Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia. What's happening there is we're seeing a lot more stability in the business and political environments. After East Timor split away from Indonesia several years ago, it was feared that that could lead to more splits, either from a fundamentalist Islamic point of view or from the Christian-dominated Bali, for example, that would split the country into numerous countries. That didn't happen, and it's become a stable force. It's able to have democratic transitions in government, and we're seeing that as building confidence in the people, building confidence in the ability to invest in the market. Seeing a similar transition in the Philippines from military rule to democracy. Thailand has slipped back into military rule, but it's had elections, it's had a relatively stable military rule and a relatively benevolent military rule, which has allowed for confidence in the people to move forward.
So that's actually kind of an interesting area there, a benevolent military rule. You tend not to see very many of those, and especially right now, look at what's going on in the Middle East.
Yeah.
People are rebelling against what started off as benevolent military, rule.
Southeast Asia is the land of the benevolent dictator. Everywhere from Singapore, which is basically a family-run organisation, to Thailand. We saw that in the Philippines. Don't get me wrong; they're not perfect political environments,
right? But
they're a stage on from where they have been historically before. And the regular person in the country has a little bit more say in their destination, their organisation, through things like social media, through access to not just Western ideas, but Chinese ideas, Indian ideas, who have a lot more influence on Southeast Asia than what we might see in the United States. They do have a very strong influence on those markets because they're the most adjacent superpowers to Southeast Asia.
So no. When I look at that region, one of the things that I've picked up on, and not being active, living in Australia and Asia Pac as you do, you can probably provide more insight on this. But I look at this and I see a group of nations that are actually willing to reach out and pull each other up.
Yeah.
Which is something that you don't typically see. Right now there's a tremendous reluctance, although we've come to an agreement in the UK. Or in the EU to help Greece, but that was a very hard-fought battle. In Southeast Asia, it seems almost as if they collectively recognize we need to pull each other up.
Yeah, the combination of Chinese, which is a very strong influence, particularly in business in Southeast Asia,
right.
Ethnic Chinese, the Malays, which is a broad cultural group, include the Malaysians, the Indonesians, and then a big influence in India. Pragmatism is the key word in that market. So if it helps, if by helping my brother I can help myself, I will help my brother. And that's a bit of an attitude that they tend to take in that market because of that realisation that they're not large enough to influence the way a China, an India or the United States has.
Right.
But if they get together, they can have some very strong pull with several hundred million consumers and residents across the Southeast Asian region. Right. They really realise the power they can have as an entity is much greater than the power they can have as independent nations, but not going to the full extent that Europe has gone and the benefits and otherwise of the EU.
So now, how much of this is being driven by China? Not as a, hey, let's get together with China, but let's coalesce so that we can stand alongside China.
They've played their cards. They're backing the Chinese to be the dominant economic superpower, certainly in our region and globally. They've been very clear in that, as I mentioned earlier, the ethnic Chinese have a very large role in the economies of Southeast Asia. Most of the billionaires of those markets are ethnically Chinese, and they are disproportionate. So that's been a very obtuse way. The Chinese government's been very involved and working closely with investing in what suits China: natural resources, telecoms, other key areas, and these countries have been quite willing to accept that investment because they get stability, they get investment, and they're able to also reverse back and develop into China. Singapore's a classic example of that.
So if you look at China then, most people think of China as being in an expansionist mode, looking to kind of extend their influence and their reach. From what I'm hearing you say, it's almost somewhat of the inverse. There are countries in Southeast Asia that recognize we may be able to penetrate into China and actually make inroads economically, perhaps further their interests there much easier.
Every country in Asia Pacific knows China. Every country is doing its best effort to be friendly with China, to have China invest in it, and to, where possible, invest or sell goods back up into China. So pragmatism, again, is very important, and the realisation of the size of that market. And increasingly, India is the other one that is starting to become an important power in that market as well, in that part of the world. Because whilst they arguably won't be as powerful as China, they're going to be a pretty strong second choice.
Yeah,
so they're investing in Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia is investing in India as well.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think at some point I see China and India actually coming to a point where there needs to be either a mutual melding of the minds, or there will be a disruptive split.
Very much so, like the Bering Straits that separated the Russians and the Americans.
Right.
Yeah. Nepal is what sits in between. They do share a common border actually, but Nepal literally and figuratively is what sits in between China and India. So yes, that will be a well looked at part of the global geopolitical map to see how those two things combine.
That's actually an interesting border, by the way, because if you look at the resources that feed the population in that border, it's not a resource-rich area.
No,
and
it's not. It's one of the poorest parts of both countries. But what's interesting is if you travel to India, you will find people from the northeastern parts of India are Chinese, ethnically are Chinese, look Chinese, but speak Indian. So you can see how the two cultures in that far northeastern part of India have melded into one, and it's quite an unusual sight to see Hindi effectively cultural people. So it's quite a unique part of the world that will, as I said, become more prevalent in the future.
Okay, so let me kind of put you on the spot here for a minute and look out 12, 36 months. What are the three sectors in that region that you really see benefiting the most from this coalescence within Southeast Asia?
Telecommunications.
Okay.
Yeah, it's at the forefront for so many organisations. They are starting to further deregulate the telecommunication sectors. Mobility is just, as it is here in the United States and other markets, is just ubiquitous. So certainly mobility and telecommunications. Resources. China loves a good hole in the ground to feed its beast, and Southeast Asian countries aren't any different. They again have a very strong demand for resources to feed their people. And then finally, consumer goods. As the middle class in ASEAN increases, they want their iPads, they want their iPhones, but they also want their basic necessities. So we're going to see a growth in those three key areas of telco, resources, and consumer goods as being really important.
Very good. Phil, thanks. I appreciate your time today and look forward to our next conversation.
Pleasure, Fred.